Okay, good evening everybody. Can you hear me all right? That's good. It's lovely to see so many people here, and before I thank Shane for inviting me to talk to the Society, I should congratulate yourselves on arriving here on a night like this, and I'm very impressed at the turnout. And last week I was emailing Shane and innocently said to him, having looked at the weather forecast, the weather looks reasonably benign next Monday. So you can see that that wasn't a very good prediction, really. So I'm speaking about something this evening which there's a large body of documentation relating to it, and yet not that many historians have addressed it in great detail. There are a few, and I'm going to make reference to them shortly. But I do think that the main purpose of me talking about it at this talk is maybe to draw more people's attention to this material and to the kind of information that you can derive from it. So we'll have a look at some of the material here. So the slide has just a little but a very nice example of a map from one of the Encumbered Estates Court sale notices, and I just wanted you to know what that looked like. So just to look at some of the material that relates to the Encumbered Estates Court and its successors, as it says there, and also maybe to give a bit of background as to what it is as well. So you can see from this slide that there were three iterations really of the body, even though it's often referred to, because I suppose it's the easiest thing to say, as the Landed Estates Court, which is sort of correct, but the Encumbered Estates Court was the first iteration of it. And in fact, the Encumbered Estates, the original body wasn't actually a court at all. It was really properly called a commission. And then later on, the Landed Estates Court was actually a court. So this is the kind of chronology that we're looking at in the body that I'm going to be talking about. And what I'm looking at really is not so much the history of the court and its operations as some of the examples of estates, landed estates in County Galway, which ended up being sold in it, and particularly the documents that tell us more about that. But before I talk about that, I will mention that there are a few scholars who have looked at this body and its workings in great detail. One of them, a long-time member of this society, was a man called Dr. Pádraig Lane. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. And Pádraig worked on the Encumbered Estates particularly, which was the earliest iteration of the body, and that was begun really in 1849 and began its workings in 1850. And over a period from about 1972 up until I think maybe 2016, Pádraig has published perhaps 8 or 10 articles, many of them in the Journal of this Society, about the workings of the Encumbered Estates Court, and particularly in Galway and Mayo, and he has looked at numerous examples of how the court interacted with specific estates. He has also examined, so that I'm not going to be doing it again, a lot of information on indebtedness amongst landed families, the value of property, the kind of people who bought the estates when they were offered for sale. So they're all topics that he has looked at in his writings, and because you're dealing with a librarian here, I've done a little handout This is what it looks like here, and there are some copies on the table there if you want it afterwards. And I have listed all of the articles that Pádraig Lane has written about the workings of the Encumbered Estates Court, so that, as I said, quite a lot of them were published in the Journal of the Society, so it should be easy enough for you to access them if you want to know more. Apart from Pádraig, other people who have looked at the Society are a man called J.A. Dowling, and he's looked at it from an entirely different perspective. He's looking at legal history, or he is a legal historian. So he's written a history of the Landed Estates Court. So that's the middle one there on the one that lasted roughly about 20 years, from 1858 to 1878. And as I said, he's looking at it from the perspective of a legal historian, but there's a lot of useful information in what he has to say. There is also a lecturer in history, Jacqueline Crowley, and for her doctorate, again, she looked at the operations of the Encumbered Estates Court, which is the first one, but she's looking only at the very beginnings of it, so about the first 5 years, and she used that as the basis for her PhD. But considering that the institution lasted for quite a long time, in a way it is surprising that not more people have looked at its workings. But anyway, I suppose as time goes on, people will. So to look at this illustration here on the left-hand side, it's a good example of the kind of illustration that you see in the printed sale notices. And what I'm talking about they're almost like what an auctioneer would produce today for the sale of a property, a sort of prospectus. And first of all, it gives you lots of information about the property that was for sale, who the owner was, where it was located, and you'll see some examples of that as we're going through the slideshow. But a feature of the sale notices very often are these kind of maps. So I know it's not that easy for you to see it there, but I think I have a better version of the map. So this property is located here in Galway City, and this sale notice dates from the late 1870s, and it was an estate owned by a family called Hall. Now, I need to do some more research on who the Hall owner actually is, because the estate was located in a few different parts of County Galway, and I'll return to that again. But this is actually here in the city of Galway, and so the street at the top of the map is Eglinton Street, and the property that the red circle is around is what we would know today as Brown Thomas. But at that time it was occupied. The tenant of the property was Alexander Moon, a familiar name I suppose to most of us, and he was paying £90 in rent to the Hall estate for the rental of that property. And then further down William Street there is a number of business premises which are still there, of course. And right down at the bottom is the property that we know as Lynch's Castle. And it's mentioned even in the sale notice as the castle. And at that time it was occupied by a man called Peter Kerwin, and he was paying £45 in rent. So all of that information is derived from the sale notice for the Hall estate. And it was only a part of the Hall estate. There was other properties elsewhere as well. But it's just an illustration, I suppose, of the type of information that the sale notice can tell us. And of course, it extols the advantages of property in Galway City, even in 1879, and its location and so on. And it eventually went for sale, and the property which we know and knew as Moon's was actually purchased by Alexander Moon in that sale, and he paid £1,350, which in 1879 was a considerable sum of money. And similarly, Lynch's Castle was purchased by Peter Kerwin, who was the tenant at the time, and he paid £800 for the property there on the corner of Abbeygate Street, and it mentions that on the corner of Abbeygate Street and Shop Street. And there are other ways that we can find out about these types of sales and the people who purchased them. And you can see this again from the same estate, the Hall estate. They had a property in the parish of Annadown and a house called Wood Park House, which is now a ruin. And again, you know, they were explaining about the good quality of land and the location and everything where Annadown, because of course the objective was to sell the property. And it was occupied. It tells us who the tenant was who was occupying the property at the time, and it was a man called Peter Newell. And in the Irish will registers, which are available from the National Archives website, there is a will belonging to Peter Newell. He died around 1890, and he specifically mentions in his will, because he's giving various portions to his children, the property that he purchased at the sale of the Hall estate, and it included Wood Park House. So, you know, it's a way of linking various kinds of information together to make a fuller picture of what we're doing. So, to return to the, a little bit to the Encumbered Estates Commission, it was established in 1849, and its purpose really was to address the issue of estates which were under severe indebtedness, particularly after the famine, of course, when far fewer of the tenants were in a position to pay any rent at all. Now, just as an aside, as I said, the legal historian J.A. Dowling mentions that even though it's called the Encumbered Estates Court, it was actually originally a commission. And the reason that it was set up was to try and sell some of these estates that were so heavily indebted. Now, many of them were indebted for a variety of reasons. I think sometimes landed estates are kind of appear in or figure in some people's minds as sort of homogeneous entities, and that both the people who owned them and the properties themselves were all very similar, but in fact almost all of them are different. No two of them are exactly alike. It's certainly the case that some estates were in debt because of the extravagant lifestyle of their owners, and particularly of the building of large houses, which had been a feature in the earlier decades of the early 19th century. But that's only one of the reasons sometimes why estates were in debt. Another reason could be the obligations that the owner had to other family members, and the drawing from the estate and the rental income of the estate for a whole variety of purposes. So this one here, the rental that you're looking at here, is from one of the Lynch estates, and this is quite an early one. It's from 1851, so it's the Encumbered Estates Court, and it was the property of a man called Andrew Henry Lynch, who had died, and it was being sold by, I assume it's his three daughters, his heiresses anyway, Mary Joyce and Rhodesia and Margaret Lynch. And the property offered for sale included 17 townlands in the parish of Rahun, which amounted to almost 3,000 acres, and the estate of the Lynches in Moycullen, which amounted to 14 townlands and about 4,000 acres. So you can see it was a very substantial estate. And one of the selling points that again was being particularly highlighted was the fact that it was very close to Galway city, where the railway was under construction. In fact, the railway eventually reached Galway in 1851, and this was perceived as a selling point. And the person, usually when you see one of these sale notices, you see the name of the owner, and then very often somebody who's described as the petitioner. And the petitioner is the person usually who, to whom the estate owes a lot of money. And in this case, the petitioner is Lord Campbell. Now, Lord Campbell was originally from Scotland, and he was a lawyer, and he was also a politician in Westminster. And Andrew Henry Lynch had been an MP for Galway. So, you know, it's possible that that's how he ended up being in debt to Lord Campbell. But in any case, it was Lord Campbell who was petitioning for the sale. And in fact, he acquired large parts of the estate at the sale. And one of the features, again, is what they call descriptive particulars. So, you know, it will give you a description of the estate and various locations. So one of the places that's described, of course, is the village of Barna, which featured as part of the estate. And it says it's desirably circumstanced, having the advantage of a post office, constabulary and coastguard stations, a good quay and a safe harbour for vessels of small burden. So we get a pretty comprehensive picture of the village of Barna from 1851. And again, another way of, you know, adding to our knowledge of that would be to look at the first edition Ordnance Survey maps, which are available online now. And you can see all of the features that are mentioned in that description, including the coastguard station, which is now the row of houses on the right-hand side as you go down towards O'Grady's restaurant. So that was where the coastguard station was located at the time. So this kind of, you know, information, the sale notices provide the opportunity really to improve our knowledge of places as well. So this is a little snippet from the same estate. This is the Lynch estate again, and I know it's difficult for you to see this, but it shows the sort of information that's particularly helpful for family historians, because it's a small example of how tenants were listed. So that's why the sale notices are frequently referred to as rentals, even though they are actually a lot more than rentals. But they would include usually a list of the townlands that are for sale in the estate and the people who were occupying the holdings in those townlands at the time. So this particular one tells us that the occupiers of, this is part of Sea Point in the village of Barna, and there was a holding occupied by Matthias and Patrick Connor, and they were renting what's described as 8 Irish acres. Now the early sale notices will often have those what's called Irish acres and then statute acres as well. So in this case it claims that the 8 Irish acres is the equivalent of 13 statute acres. The sale notices later on tend to be mostly just listed in statute acres. And they had a lease, which is a little bit unusual. They had a lease from Andrew Henry Lynch from 1841. And the lease was for the life of Patrick Connor. I presume this is the same Patrick Connor, who was still living, or 31 years. So it's an interesting example of the type of leases that were still being made available to tenants on estates in County Galway as late as 1841. You will often get that type of detail, but the leases are usually earlier. Many of the landlords weren't giving long leases by the 1840s. So that type of information is very important for people who are perhaps tracing family history, but it's also interesting in our knowledge for land holding in the area. Now this looks like gobbledygook, but I'll explain what it is. So one of the reasons that estates were often in debt were due to various sort of legal settlements that were made or legal obligations that were charged on the income of the estate. So all of the rents that were paid to the estate had to be divvied out in various ways, and one of the ways was this, various kinds of settlement. So this example is, again, it's a will, and this time it's another one of the Lynch family, but it's the Lynches in Renmore. The house, the building is still there. And interestingly, in the description, it describes the house as Renmore Park. I had never seen it called that before. I had always seen it as Renmore House, but in the will it says Renmore Park. And it's the will of Patrick Mark Lynch, and it dates from 1861. And again, he has various provisions of different kinds, but one of them is an annuity to his dearly beloved wife, Ellen, who was originally Ellen Wilson. And the annuity was a yearly charge on the rent of £200. So obviously the rental income for his estate, £200 was kind of earmarked for his wife as an annuity for her. And that would be the type of thing. Now, there's a more extreme example of that, if you like. And this looks even more medieval in its writings, but this is actually a will as well, and this one is from 1858. This is from the St. George estate in Headford, and it's the will of Richard Mansfield St. George from 1858, as I said. Now, first of all, it's a hugely informative document, and one of the things it tells us, now it was a very big estate with quite a substantial rental income, but even so, the first thing we learn from it is that he had a debt, a mortgage of £20,000 pounds sterling, which he had raised from his brother, and on which he had paid 5,000 on account, so obviously there was still quite a lot outstanding. And another provision in that document is this time a settlement for his wife of £1,000. So, you know, you can see that there was an awful lot of drawings on that estate. And it's no surprise, I suppose, when you hear all of those, that eventually that St. George estate came for sale. Now, surprisingly, in some ways, it didn't actually come up for sale until 1876. So it's the Landed Estates Court that it eventually came up. There were 39 lots, which is a very large estate. It was over 7,000 statute acres. Now, it claimed that there was a net annual rental income of over 5,000. So even despite all of the charges on the estate, it claimed that there was a net annual income, but one would have to be a little bit sceptical about that. Again, it provides us with, you know, a good description of various. I'm only reading a very small piece of it here. I'm sure if there's any Headford people here, they'd be particularly gratified to hear that the tenants are respectable, peaceable, and industrious, and some of them have considerable interest in their farms. Now, the fact that it says some of them have considerable interest suggests that some of them didn't, but anyway, so they might have been too pleased about that. And the other thing, of course, that they were very interested in highlighting was that the portions of the estate adjoining Loch Corrib, of which there were quite a few, there is excellent salmon and trout fishing, and the game rights are strictly preserved. So, you know, we know that people in Headford are still very fond of the salmon and trout fishing, so that was going on as long ago as 1876. So the Landed Estates Court eventually came into existence in 1858, and in a way the idea was that it was putting the workings of the Encumbered Estates Commission on a more legal footing, if you like. And for one thing, it had its own courtrooms and its own judges. So there were particular people whose only role was to adjudicate on these sales. And as well as the sale notices, the results of the sales, if you like, are reported every day in the newspapers. So it's a very interesting matter. If you look at one of these sale notices and you see the date that the sale was supposed to take place, you can go usually to either the Irish Times or the Freeman's Journal, both of which are archives of which are available now. You can look at both of those and see if it did sell, and very often it will tell you who sold it, who purchased it. Now, it doesn't always tell you that information, because sometimes it will say, you know, purchased in trust by a certain person's solicitor, you know, so that doesn't mean that he was buying it for himself. He was usually buying it for somebody else. But very often it will tell you who purchased it, so you can trace, you know, who the landlord might have been after the sale had happened. So the sale notice that we're looking at here is a Landed Estates Court sale notice, and it's from 1872. And this is from the parish of Killimer in East Galway. And it's an interesting one, I suppose, because it relates to the Eyre family. And we know, of course, that branches of the Eyre family had property here in the city as well. So there's a few unusual features about this one. The owners are Thomas Stratford Eyre the elder and Thomas Stratford Eyre the younger, as well as a man called Alan Pollock. Now, we'll hear more about Alan Pollock presently, but just to go back to the two heirs, it actually says on the sale notice that Thomas Stratford Eyre the elder is about 84, and the younger Thomas is 50 years of age. Now, it's the only example I have come across where the ages of the vendors are actually in the sale notice, which is very unusual, and I'm not quite sure why. And the petitioners were the Scottish National Insurance Company. So again, this would have been a body that the heirs had obviously raised a mortgage with, and they couldn't pay it. And this is kind of revealed to us because it tells us that the younger Thomas was insolvent, so he was in debt to such an extent. So there was 1,400 statute acres, and the house, which was known as Heirville, and the domain lands. And this appears to be, I'd say it would be a property maybe that would benefit from a lot of research, because it seems to have featured there was a court called the Court of Chancery, which was the main court for landed estates dealings before the Landed Estates Court was set up. And it always took years to come to any decision, and apparently this Heirville estate had frequently appeared in the Court of Chancery. So a final example of sale notices from the different kinds of courts. This is the Land Judges Court, which is the last one. And the Land Judges Court was established around 1878, and it continued in existence for quite a long time, but the scale of sales gradually tapered off really especially into the 1890s. And then, as we know, the land legislation which came in after, especially after 1900, kind of changed the whole perspective of how this was done. So this one refers to the Bodkin estate at the townland is called Kilclooney, but the house is sometimes known as Quarrymount House. So anybody who's from near Milltown or Tuam might know it as either of those names. It's in the barony of Dunmore. And it was the estate of John James Bodkin, and it was offered for sale in the 1880s, and he had died in 1882. I think this is 1884. Now you can see that this is the title page of the sale notice, and it's crowded with information. I mean, you could be looking at that for a long time before you take everything in that was in it. The notice also includes, the same as all the others, the various lots and the people who were occupying the different townlands and the different kinds of tenants. And one of them includes the house itself, Quarrymount House, and at the time it was occupied by a man called Edward O'Kelly, and he had a lease agreement with Bodkin which he had signed in 1881, so just before, the year before Bodkin had died, for 31 years again. So the different kinds of courts, I suppose, the documents relating to them they don't change that much really, the sale notices, but there are specific features, of different ones. And the main reason for the establishment of the original Encumbered Estates Court, and then that it continued, one of the main things was the fact that they would be able to sell the estate pretty quickly, and the second thing was that the title would be guaranteed to the person who was purchasing it, and that was regarded as a major advantage. And it had been hoped, I think, by the government when they were bringing this in, that it would encourage a lot of investment from outside the country. Now, we'd have to do more research really to see how much that actually came through from the sales. So one of the things that I looked at really were the people, and this is something which Pádraig Lane had looked at in great detail, much more so than I'm going to do here, was the idea that people would buy estates for commercial reasons, that they weren't people who had any connection with the area, but that they would buy an estate for commercial reasons. And I suppose one good example of this is the estate, several estates which were purchased by a man called Alan Pollock, mostly in East Galway. The two biggest ones were quite close to in the parish of Clontuskert really, and quite close to the River Suck, a large estate there. And the second one was in northeast Galway, near the village of Glinsk, and that had been a Burke estate originally. And this image that you're seeing here is a drawing of the house which Pollock built in the Clontuskert estate, a house called Lisnanny, which doesn't actually exist any longer. And when Pádraig Lane was writing about the work that Pollock did, he describes it as an attempt at commercial farming in Ireland. Not necessarily a terribly successful attempt. Well, it was for a while, but it didn't leave him with a great reputation. And there's an excellent local history of the parish of Clontuskert, which includes a very good synopsis of the history of this Pollock estate. So Pollock was originally from Scotland, and the family had made money through industrial concerns, very successful industrial concerns, and then he went into politics, and then, as I said, he bought property. But one of the features of his estate in East Galway, well, in both areas, in Glinsk and in Lisnanny, were the number of evictions from the estate, which of course left him with a very bad reputation. So much so that almost 25 years after he died, in 1907, there was a royal commission sat in Ballinasloe and took evidence from witnesses about the state of land holding and farming and everything in the area. It was a national commission, and several of the witnesses roundly condemned the activities of the Pollock estate. Now, it still existed at that stage because it was inherited by his son, but it's extraordinary how long the legacy lasted. Now, there are quite a lot of pieces of estate architecture, I suppose, that survive from that time, but the house itself doesn't survive. But there are lots of gate lodges and other buildings. If I just move on one there, you can see there it's the Ordnance Survey map, but it shows a huge farm complex which Pollock built on the estate, and which sadly caught fire and was entirely destroyed in the early 1900s. So there's very little of that left now either. But he was a very controversial figure, and the work he was doing was controversial as well. Now, a different sort of, but I suppose in the same vein, another kind of landlord were what we'd call today corporate landlords, really. And this is the Law Life Assurance Company, which would have been the biggest of these that operated in County Galway. And they acquired the Martin estate, and lots of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the Martin estate, centred on Ballynahinch Castle in Connemara. And Thomas Martin died in 1847, and he was hugely in debt to the Law Life Assurance Company. And eventually they acquired most of the estate. And they held on to it for about, I think, nearly 20 years before eventually they sold it to a man called Richard Berridge, who again came from an industrial background. But Berridge held it for quite a long time after that. And it was a massive estate with property in a lot of different parts of West Galway. And this slide comes from a map, which we have a volume of maps in the special collections in the library, which were drawn at the time that the estate was first offered for sale, which was 1849. And it was offered in two different tranches in, I think it's June and November 1849. But they're beautiful maps, and they're numbered according to the townlands, and then you get accompanying that the names of the tenants who were occupying those townlands at the time. So you can again see how, somebody who would be working on townlands which were originally part of that estate, of the Martin estate, you could trace forward from that maybe as to what became of them in the end. So there's a number of different types of research, I suppose, that the sale notices have potential to assist with. And clearly one is genealogical research. So, for example, you get in the notices the townland and the occupiers of various holdings within that townland. Sometimes you can get more information in terms of perhaps leases. If they had leases, you might find more things. A second possible research avenue that could be pursued would be the whole implications of the economic descriptions that you get, like, for example, you know, the description of Headford and so on, and also the information that they provide on place names and descriptions of physical particulars of places. So one of the things they help with, for instance, and as I'm sure you're all aware, the absence of census data from this period. So, and again, most of you probably are aware of Griffith's valuation. So Griffiths dates for County Galway, most of it dates from the mid-1850s, and then we don't have anything approximating to a census really until 1901. So if you happen to have a sale notice from some decades after Griffiths, it can help to bridge that gap really. So this is an example, again, this is from the Bodkin estate. So this is Kilclooney or Quarrymount House, which still is in very good shape, as you can see. And so we know from the 1850s that it was a Bodkin house. And then we're looking here at the 1901 census, and it seems to be just looked after by a caretaker in the 1901 census. And in the last column there, in the 1901 census, this is the house and buildings return, which will tell you a lot of information, but the landholder, as it's called, is the Irish Land Commission. So you can see that the estate had begun to be acquired and divided by the Irish Land Commission by 1901. And then in 1911, it's now occupied by a family called Gordon, who owned it for a good many years. So, you know, the sale notices, as I mentioned earlier, told us that it was occupied by a man called Edward O'Kelly. So you can trace the ownership of, or the occupation at least, of the house through various different kinds of documents, you know. So this is an example, I suppose, of how we can find out things about the economic life of the country at the time, and the different types of, you know, for example, in the case of Headford, it describes, this is 1876, the sale of the St. George estate. So there were fairs for the sale of cattle held at Headford in March, May, July, August and October. You know, so again, it was describing the economic potential of the area. And the information on the lower part of the slide, that relates to what's called the Ross Hill estate, which is Ross Hill near Clonbur. So if any of you are familiar with Clonbur and you know where the graveyard is, that was part of the Ross Hill estate. But within the sale notice for that estate, it describes quite a detailed and an expert description, as in somebody who was qualified to I presume he was an engineer. It's all about the mines. There were lead mines and other kinds of mines in that area. And when the estate was being offered for sale, obviously this was, you know, I suppose a selling point really as to the economic potential of the estate itself. This is always an intriguing one. This is from 1865, and it's the sale of an estate in Portumna, just on the outskirts of the town of Portumna, a Palmer, an estate owned by the Palmer family. But in large letters there, it tells us the house and domain of Pokeroko. And now it doesn't sound like a name that originates in Portumna or any part of County Galway. And I have shown this a few times at talks in Portumna, much to the mystification of people who know a great deal more about Portumna than I do. And it's a house that was and is still known as Fairy Hill, on the outskirts of the town. So people are always mystified when I produce this, but this is the printed sale notice for the Palmer estate. And the only other piece of information I have been able to find is that there is a court case which cites all sorts of documents from the 18th century and specifically says the domain of Pokeroko. Now, what or where Pokeroko came from is still unknown to me. So it's a mystery that sometime maybe we might eventually solve. But you know, it's quite funny. It sounds like something from the Eastern world. It certainly doesn't sound like anything in Portumna anyway. So you know, that's a topographical. It's a piece of topographical information which probably isn't available anywhere else except on the sale notice. And again, the other thing, and this is probably always of interest, I think, there were quite a number of sale notices, particularly in the early years, where an illustration of the house was, usually a lithograph, was printed of the house. So this is Waterdale House, which is quite close. The townland is still there, of course, called Waterdale, close to Galway. And it was a Staunton or a Lynch Staunton house at different times. But we have never been able to find any other photograph or illustration or anything else of Waterdale except this image that appeared in the sale notice. So, you know, for that reason it's really important. And it's not just ourselves in the Landed Estates database, but Patrick Melvin, of whom some of you I'm sure are aware, he has written a very definitive book about Landed Estates in County Galway. He told me that he had failed to find any other image of Waterdale apart from this one either. So again, you know, an illustration of how the sale notices can provide us with information of different kinds. Now you're probably getting tired listening to me at this stage. So after extolling all the benefits of looking at sale notices, how do you look at them, or what collections are there? So there is no one definitive collection. And in fact, I'd say there could be some work necessary on trying to put together a definitive list of the estates that were actually sold. But for County Galway and most other counties, in fact, the biggest collections are held in the major national repositories. So there are two collections in the National Archives. One of them is known as the O'Brien collection because they were deposited there by a man called Peter O'Brien. And they cover the period from 1850 to 1885, so they're regarded as the most comprehensive collection. There is a second collection in the National Archives, and there are two in the National Library, and there is also a collection in the Public Record Office in Belfast, which, despite the fact that it's in Belfast, it includes sale notices from the whole of Ireland. So they would be the national collections, if you like. Now, I'll go back to the online ones in a minute. But there are also, in many of the county libraries, there are collections of the physical sale notices too. And in the case of yourselves here in Galway, the Galway Local Studies Library in Nuns Island has copies of lots of sale notices relating to County Galway. And in the library in the university, we have two useful resources. One is a microfilm collection of the O'Brien sale notices from the National Archives. So it's the originals are in the National Archives, and they microfilmed them for preservation reasons, and we got a copy of the microfilm. And a second set, which are very unusual set, and on which hopefully I might do some more work at some point. These are a hard copy set of 29 bound volumes of the sale notices, and most of the sale notices in them relate to County Clare, but because lots of estates had land in more than one county, there can be material relating to other counties as well. And in fact, that sale notice relating to the Hall estate comes from there because they had land in County Clare as well. This bound volume set came originally from the library of Lord Dunboyne, who was a member of the Butler family and had a house near Bunratty. I don't know how long or when it came to the library in the university. The late Christy Townley, whom some of you might have known, who was the librarian in the university for many years, Christy used to visit when I started working there first, and I asked him one day what he knew about them, and when I would ask him something like that and he didn't know, he would say, that was here before I came. So Christy had come to work in the library in the 1930s, so I know that the sale notices, the Dunboyne collection, were in the library before that time. They have Lord Dunboyne's bookplate on them, so that's how we know they came from that library. They're a great example of, you know, how, I suppose, bibliographically, how, because the sale notices were produced as loose leaf things, but obviously he had them bound and kept in the library, you know. So, and somebody has even gone to the trouble sometimes in some of the volumes of listing the estates that are included in each volume, not in all cases, but in some instances. So there is ways of accessing these. Nowadays you can also access them online. If you have a subscription to either Ancestry or Find My Past, the two big genealogical databases, they're included on those, but the access to them on those is not the easiest because they're designed for looking for the name of a person rather than a place or, you know, more information about the estate. But you can actually access them on both Ancestry and Find My Past. But as I said, they're not necessarily the easiest thing to look at that way. So finally then, I'll just mention that on the Landed Estates database, and I'm not going to do a big talk on that tonight, but on the Landed Estates database, we have included reference to a sale notice if we know that the estate was sold in either the encumbered or the landed estate or the land judge's courts. And there's a way of finding a listing of the Galway ones at the top right-hand corner of the home page of the Landed Estates database. There's a link called Data Sources, and if you click on Data Sources and then you search for Galway County Library, you'll get a good listing of the sale notices that they hold, many of which we would have on our microfilm copy as well. So, because some people come back to me and say, but I couldn't find any sale notice, but not every estate was sold in the Landed Estates Court. You're only going to find the ones that were offered for sale. So remember that as well. Many of the estates never appear in the court, so there's not going to be a sale notice for them. So that's just a portion of that list of the material that's held in Galway County Library. That's the Landed Estates database there. This is just an extract from the Blake of Corrafin estate. And each of the entries in the estate, the Landed Estates database, has a small description of the estate, a listing of the houses that feature on the estate. But in the archival sources, if the estate was sold in the Landed Estates Court, there will be a reference to that in the archival sources. And it will include the number of the microfilm on which that sale notice appears. So if you do want to come and visit us in Special Collections to look at the sale notice, it would be much better if you had previously looked at the database and found out which estate you're talking about, and secondly, what the microfilm is that it's on. Because each microfilm has hundreds of notices on it, so you know you're not going to want to go through all of that. So you need to find out in advance, and you can do that by looking at the database. Now, that's Shane's next lecture, so I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for your attention.